Welcome to Sew with Monty. In this section of the casual shirt video series, we're going to work on the collar and setting it to the neckline. The two collar pieces is, one side is interfaced, one isn't, and I've got them face to face. Now, how we're going to sew the collar, instead of going all the way around three edges and creating the corners, we're going to start by sewing the outside edge and understitching it first. So let's go to the sewing machine and I'll show you how to do this. Along the top edge of this collar, right here, I'm going to sew with a 5/8 inch seam allowance, which is what the pattern requires. And then I'm going to grade the seam, press, and understitch it. So the first part of this will be sewing with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. I've sewn the top seam only of my collar, and I've graded the seam. I've trimmed down the interfacing side to about half the width of the total seam allowance. And then I've pressed the seam over to the interfacing side of my collar. The next step is we'll go to the sewing machine and I'm going to understitch right along here on the interfacing side of my collar to keep this from rolling out and showing on the top collar. So let's go back to the machine. So now I'm going to understitch the collar. I'm going to sew on the side where the seam allowance is folded toward, which is the interfacing side, and I'm going to go close to the seam, and I want to use a 3-stitch leg and just come down through here. Back up a little bit when I start. So now my collar, the top seam or the outer edge of my collar is stitched down with an understitch on here. This makes it really nice because when I fold it over to sew the sides, that understitch is going to keep this folded exactly where it needs to stay, and it locks it in position. So now what I do is just sew my corners at 5/8. Now note one thing, when you do this, your under collar, the one with the interfacing, will be slightly longer. That's okay. Now I have the side of my collar sewn. I'm going to do this on both sides. And the next thing I'm going to do is cut an angle at the tip of the collar itself. This relieves bulk out of this area, so when I turn it, it won't be bulky in there. And I'm going to grade this seam just like I did the outer seam of my collar. And I'm just going to take the interfacing only, and I want to cut it back to about half. And then once you have both of those tips done, you can use a collar turner, and you just turn your collar. So now my collar's turned, and you can see how pretty it is even without pressing. So I'll go back to my iron and I'll press it and then determine whether or not I want any top stitching on it. So I've decided not to top stitch my collar. I like the looks without any stitching on it. So I've got a nice press, and because I've understitched this edge and then sewed my sides separately, I've got really nice sharp defined points on my collar. And it's ready to be set into the neckline of my shirt. Note that the under collar is slightly longer. That's no big deal. I've got 5/8 inch of a seam allowance right here, so I'll use it all using the outside edge as my go-to for measurement. So let's go ahead and start working on the body so that we can set our collar in the neckline. And now I'm going to join the yoke to the front of my shirt. Not the back, I just want to join it to the front so that I can set the collar. Then I can join the back to the shirt later. It makes it a little easier to handle if I don't have the back, the yoke, and the front all up here at once. And put the yoke right sides together to my fronts. And I'm going to pin across through here and sew at a 5/8 inch seam allowance. So now I have my yoke attached to my front, my two front pieces here. And I've decided to just use an edge stitch on my seams. Now I could do a top stitch, I could do all kinds of really clever things here, but I'm just going to do an edge stitch here. I want to keep my outer stitching minimal. So let's turn it over. And what I've done here is I've sewn my 5/8 inch seam allowance with a 3 stitch length. And then I've come back and I've taken the two seams, the seam allowances, and serged them together so that you have the edges finished off nice and neat. Now I put them together because I've pressed them both toward the yoke. So when you're doing this type of work, your yoke is where you press your seam allowances into, in the front and along the back when we get to that point. The next step will be I'm going to take it to the sewing machine and I'm just going to edge stitch right here 1/8 of an inch away from the seam on each of these seams. And then I'll come back over here and I'll show you how to set the collar. I'm ready to top stitch or edge stitch my shoulder seam between my yoke and my front. And I've lined my needle up. I've got it in the left hand position and I've got it set on 3 because I want to see the stitch. And I've lined it up so that my fold of my seam is going to be right in the middle of the gap of my foot. And that's what I'm going to be looking at when I sew. And now I'm ready to begin the other side, so I can just link them together instead of cutting the thread. Now I'm ready to set my collar. And I've pressed it really good, and I've also added a stay stitch around the neckline here, about a fat 3/8 from the edge. This is going to help control this neckline and keep it from stretching out while I'm trying to put the collar on. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to pin the collar onto the neckline. And in the back of the collar, I have 2 notches right here. Now sometimes you'll just have a center back notch, but I have 2. So the first thing I'm going to do is align these notches and put my pins in perpendicular so that I can get them out as I sew. Here, the next thing I want to pin is this front edge to this notch. I'm not worried about anything in between right now. I'm just going to get all of this pinned. Now note when I'm pinning this, I'm pinning the entire collar to the front edge. In the back I just pinned the under collar, the part that had the interfacing on it. In the front I'm going to pin the entire collar. I'm going to do that on both sides. Pinning here is everything. Having the stay stitch is going to make the pinning more successful, and you're not going to get as aggravated with it as you're going along. Now, when you have this pin, you want to take one side between the pins at a time, and you want to pin the collar to the neckline. And see, the stay stitch actually helps me control that. Now, to the seam line, to the shoulder seam line right here, this little shoulder seam line, I'm going to pin the collar entirely to the neckline. And right there's where I'm going to stop that. So I'm going to pin this whole section so the entire collar is pinned to the neckline. Right here, I'm going to clip the top collar, and you have to be very careful not to over clip here. You don't want to go too deep, but you want to clip just shy of 5/8 inch right here. So I'm going to cut it like a fat 1/2 inch right where the collar seam is. I'm going to do that on both sides. And in the rest of this part of the neck, I'm going to flip the top collar out of the way and continue pinning the rest of the collar down. The more pins, the merrier. This is going to be a good place to pin a lot, because if you pin a lot, you're going to have less chances of sewing a tuck in here. Now, when you sew your collar, don't be afraid to put a little tension on it. You can stretch it a little bit as you sew. There's nothing wrong with that. That will also keep you from getting tucks in your neckline or your collar. So what we're going to do, we're going to go back to the sewing machine and we're going to sew along this edge. All of the collar will be sewn here. Then when we get to here, we're going to sew just the back collar and then back to all of the collar over here. So let's go. So I'm going to start on this end of my collar, and I'm going to sew everything, the neckline and my collar in its entirety, till I get to the first seam where my yoke shoulder seam is. And I'm just going to start here, keeping a 5/8 inch seam allowance. And just back up a little bit when you get started so that you have that collar well set on that corner. And then always check under here to make sure the neckline is laying flat and you don't have any little tucks in there. Do that frequently so that you don't have any issues. And we're going to sew all the way through here to the other side, making sure when we sew to this clip, we have the top collar pushed out of the way. Now this is the back neck, and this is what I was talking about. I just want to check and make sure I don't have any tucks in there. And then I'm going to just hold my hand here and hold my hand here and just give it a little tuck. See, just a little bit like that, so that I know everything is laying flat and doing what it's supposed to do. Take the pins out as you come to them and just give it a little tug. You don't have to stretch it. You don't have to be hard on it. Just keep it flat. So once you have your collar sewn on, just turn it over and make sure you don't have any tucks in the neckline itself. If you do, it's no big deal. I have one, so I'm going to show you how to get rid of it because that's a good example. If you have a tuck, take a seam ripper or your scissors and just pop the stitch where the tuck is. And then if you just pop that out, and then this time, instead of sewing on the collar side, I'm going to flip it over and I'm going to sew it on the neck side to make sure I get the tuck out of there. So I just start just prior to where the tuck was and then come back across. This happens frequently. It's not a sign of your sewing abilities. It's just something that is very prone to happen. So don't feel like it's that you're not sewing properly. And see, I've patched where the tuck was, and now I'm ready to go on to the next step. Now I have my collar attached to my neckline, as you can see, and it's tuck free, and this is open in the back neck and secured entirely on the front. I'm going to trim the strings and do a little clipping. So around this back section and even in the front, I'm just going to add some clips just to relax the neckline. Now back here I can just do it in the back. I don't need to do it all the way through. Better not to clip this top collar in the back because you're going to need it because you're going to turn it under. So better not to do that unless you absolutely have to. Don't overclip. I try to keep my clips no more than an inch together or close, you know, a gap of an inch, no less than that. And once you have it clipped, I stay about 1/8 of an inch away from the seam. I don't want to get too close to the seam. Then I can lay my collar down, and what I'm going to do is first press the back neck up. And to do that, I'm going to use my pins. I'm going to get everything out of the way here because that's where my clip is. And I'm just going to also clip this section too. You want to clip your under collar now at the shoulder seam so everything's clipped because you have to be able to push this up into the collar. So I'm going to push it up like this, pin it down and press this. And then I'm going to take this section and turn it over and just hide the seam and press it down as well. Remember, when you're pressing, pins are your friend. So let me do that and I'll show you the next step after that. I have my back collar, the top collar, turned under and pinned down and pressed, making sure that I left the front collar, the seam exposed, so that I can catch this with my facing. So my facing will go here. This part will be edge stitched down and the collar will be set onto the shirt. So let's go edge stitch this down and take a look at our collar, and then we'll be ready for the next part. So now I'm ready to sew this back neckline along the edge of my collar. Noting again that I have left the seam exposed in the front part of the neck so that it can be captured with the facing. We're going to start right at the shoulder seam, and I'm going to line my needle up so that I'm sewing right along the edge, just a little bit more than 1/16 of an inch. I'm using a 3-stitch again, but if you want to use something smaller you can here because this is kind of a detail area. Usually a 3 will be sufficient. I don't favor the 2.5 because it's a little bit too close together. Now as you're doing this, make sure you watch your speed. If you need to turn it down a little bit, that's perfectly fine. I also put my needle or my pins in parallel to the seam like this because it holds more section of it before I get to the pin head itself. Don't sew over your pins though. That's not a good idea, ever. And when you get to the next side, you just want to back up right at the seam, where the seam is exposed for the front neck. So let's lay it out on the ironing board and I can show you what it looks like, and then the next section of videos will show you how to do the facing and move forward with your shirt.